They say you can't fight City Hall, or in my case, the Homeowners Association. But sometimes, when they push you too far, you discover that even a suburban David can take down a Goliath, armed with bylaws and a belligerent sense of entitlement. It all started because my two magnificent weeping willows, trees that had graced my property long before the HOA even existed, supposedly ruined their precious collective view. A view that, ironically, now included a series of ever-expanding bogs where their prized, manicured lawns used to be. If you've ever dealt with an HOA run by petty tyrants, you'll understand the slow burn of indignation that led to this. But I doubt any of them anticipated the full, muddy extent of their comeuppance. My property was the last one before the development thinned out into a small, wooded preserve, and my back garden was my sanctuary. The twin willows, ancient and grand, stood sentinel near the far edge of my land. Their branches cascaded down like verdant waterfalls, creating a cool, shaded haven in the summer, their leaves whispering secrets with every breeze. They weren't just aesthetically pleasing. They were an ecosystem unto themselves, attracting birds and offering a sense of timelessness that was a stark contrast to the cookie-cutter houses that had sprung up around my older, more established lot. I bought the place, knowing these trees were a significant feature, a living legacy. For years, things were peaceful. The newer neighbors kept to themselves, and I to mine. The HOA, in its early days, was mostly concerned with lawn mowing schedules and holiday decoration conformity, minor annoyances, easily navigated. But then came the new board, spearheaded by a woman named Brenda Milligan, a recent transplant from some hyper-regulated gated community who seemed to believe her divine purpose was to sanitize our neighborhood into a beige replica of her former paradise. Brenda, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes and whose voice carried the grating edge of perpetual disapproval, quickly became the self-appointed arbiter of taste and decency. Her primary focus, it seemed, was achieving unobstructed panoramic vistas for the homes slightly uphill from me, homes whose occupants paid a premium for views that, apparently, my willows were selfishly hoarding. The first hint of trouble came as a politely worded, yet firm, newsletter suggestion about optimizing view corridors by trimming or removing obstructive vegetation. My willows weren't explicitly named, but given their size and location, the implication was as clear as Brenda probably wished her view was. I initially dismissed it. Surely, they couldn't be serious about demanding I alter decades-old, healthy trees on my own private property. These weren't overgrown shrubs. They were landmarks. I attended the next HOA meeting, mostly out of curiosity, and to gauge the temperature. Brenda, with a laminated pointer and a laser-like focus, gestured towards a crudely drawn map where my property was marked with a large red X. Residences on the upper slopes, she declared, her voice echoing slightly in the rented community hall, have expressed concerns regarding significant view obstruction from Lot 17's overgrown foliage. Lot 17 was me. The overgrown foliage was my willows. A murmur went through the assembled homeowners, a mix of sycophantic nods from Brenda's allies and uncomfortable shifting from others who probably just wanted to get home. I raised my hand. Brenda, I began, keeping my voice calm. Those willow trees are mature, healthy specimens and have been there for over 50 years. They are a significant feature of my property and, frankly, the neighborhood. Her smile tightened. We appreciate your attachment, Mr. Henderson, she said, the Mr. Henderson dripping with condescension. But the collective enjoyment of the community and the optimization of property values are paramount. We're talking about a considerable increase in desirability for several homes if their sightlines are improved. Another board member, a nervous man named Gerald who always looked like he'd just been scolded, chimed in. Yes, An unobstructed view can add significant market value, which benefits everyone. I tried to reason with them. I explained the trees' age, their ecological benefit, the shade they provided, even their sentimental value. I pointed out that the deeds and covenants in place when I bought my home made no mention of view easements over my property. Brenda simply waved a dismissive hand. The covenants also state that no homeowner shall permit a condition to exist on their property that is detrimental to the aesthetic harmony of the community. Uncontrolled, view-blocking growth could certainly be interpreted as such. Her interpretation, of course, was the only one that mattered in her mind. I remember leaving that meeting with a knot in my stomach. It wasn't just about the trees anymore. It was about the sheer audacity, the overreach of power. They were essentially demanding I vandalize my own property for their perceived benefit. Over the next few weeks, the informal suggestions became formal requests, then thinly veiled warnings. I consulted the original HOA bylaws and my property deeds. There was nothing explicitly giving them the right to demand the removal of healthy trees on private land solely for view enhancement. The aesthetic harmony clause was vague, dangerously so in the hands of someone like Brenda. I sent a polite but firm letter back, outlining my position and stating my refusal to cut down the trees. I even offered a compromise. I'd have them professionally thinned slightly, a gesture of goodwill, though it pained me to even consider it. Brenda's response was a curt note stating that thinning would be insufficient and that a more permanent solution is required. The battle lines were being drawn, and I could sense this was more than just a dispute over foliage. It was a test of wills, and Brenda was not accustomed to being denied. She probably saw me as a stubborn obstacle to her grand vision of a perfectly aligned, view-optimized utopia. Little did she know, those willows were doing more than just blocking her preferred scenery. They were holding back a secret that the earth beneath our feet had kept for a very long time. The HOA's pressure campaign began to ramp up, transitioning from passive-aggressive newsletter mentions to direct, registered letters. Each one was more insistent than the last, penned in Brenda Milligan's distinctive, spiky handwriting or, more often, typed with an air of cold, corporate authority that belied the petty nature of the dispute. The letters cited various non-specific clauses from the HOA covenants, twisted and reinterpreted to suggest my beautiful willows were somehow akin to a hazardous waste dump or a rogue junkyard. They spoke of community standards, aesthetic integrity, and, repeatedly, the sacrosanct view shed that my trees were supposedly despoiling. I continued to respond politely but firmly, referencing my property rights and the lack of any legitimate basis for their demands. I felt like I was communicating with a brick wall, or rather, a committee of brick walls, chaired by one particularly dense and unyielding boulder. I began documenting everything: copies of their letters, my replies, photographs of the trees from various angles to show their health and majesty, and even started a log of informal encounters. Brenda, emboldened by her board position, would sometimes casually run into me while I was gardening or walking, always steering the conversation back to the tree situation. "Mr. Henderson," she'd say, her voice dripping with false concern, "we really do need to find a resolution. Some of the neighbors are becoming quite insistent." The implication was clear. I was the problem, the lone holdout disrupting her carefully constructed neighborhood harmony. I knew she was trying to paint me as unreasonable, the cranky neighbor unwilling to make a small sacrifice for the greater good. The neighbors she referred to were, of course, her inner circle, the ones whose property values she was championing. I even heard whispers, relayed by a more sympathetic neighbor, that Brenda was telling people the trees were diseased and a potential hazard, a complete fabrication. My willows were vibrant, their limbs strong, their foliage dense. I had an arborist inspect them annually, and they were always given a clean bill of health. I considered getting a formal arborist's report to counter her baseless claims, but part of me still couldn't believe they would actually attempt to force the issue beyond harassment. How naive I was. The demands escalated to official violation notices, threatening fines if the offending foliage wasn't removed within 30 days. This was when I started to seriously consider legal advice, though the cost was a concern. I researched tree laws in my state and county, delved deeper into the HOA's own governing documents. The language was often frustratingly vague, clearly written to give the board maximum discretionary power. The aesthetic harmony clause was a catch. All they seemed to believe gave them carte blanche. I presented my findings at another HOA meeting, calmly and methodically, pointing out the legal precedents that protected homeowners from arbitrary demands for tree removal on private property unless a genuine nuisance or hazard was proven. Brenda and her cohort listened with stony faces. "Mr. Henderson," she said when I had finished, her tone sharper than usual, "we have our own legal interpretations, and the board has voted. The trees must go. If you do not comply, the HOA will be forced to take action to rectify the situation and bill you for the costs." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a direct challenge. My compromise of professional thinning had been utterly rejected. They wanted obliteration. I remember walking away from that meeting feeling a potent mix of anger and anxiety. They were actually going to try and force this. The 30-day notice period ticked by. I sent another registered letter, formally stating that any attempt to enter my property or harm my trees would be considered trespassing and vandalism, and that I would pursue all available legal remedies. I hoped this explicit warning would make them pause. For a couple of weeks, an uneasy quiet settled. No more letters, no drive-by critiques from Brenda. I almost allowed myself to hope they had finally seen reason, or perhaps their legal counsel had advised them to back down. It was the calm before the storm. I had to go out of town for a long weekend for a family commitment. I left with a sense of unease, but I also reasoned that surely they wouldn't be so brazen as to act while I was clearly, demonstrably away. I even asked my friendly neighbor to keep an eye out, though I didn't specify my deepest fears, not wanting to sound paranoid. I should have trusted my gut. I returned late on Sunday evening, tired from the drive. As I pulled into my driveway, something felt instantly wrong. The silhouette of my house against the twilight sky was different, starker. It took a moment for my sleep-deprived brain to process. The trees. My magnificent willows were gone. Not trimmed, not thinned. Gone. Vanished. In their place were two raw, ugly stumps, each several feet across, gleaming obscenely in the dusk. The ground around them was a mess of wood chips, sawdust, and deep ruts from heavy equipment. Branches and debris were haphazardly piled near my fence line. It was a scene of brutal, efficient destruction. I stumbled out of my car, a wave of disbelief, and then a searing, white-hot rage washing over me. They had actually done it. They had come onto my property without permission and destroyed something precious, something irreplaceable. It was an act of arrogance, of profound disrespect, a flagrant abuse of power. My hands were shaking. I walked over to the stumps, the air thick with the scent of freshly cut willow wood, a smell that now felt like a funeral dirge. The clean, sharp cuts spoke of professional tree fellers, not some amateur hack job. This was premeditated, organized. I felt violated, as if my home itself had been assaulted. The carefully constructed calm I had tried to maintain throughout this ordeal shattered into a million pieces. They hadn't just cut down trees. They had trespassed, vandalized, and declared open war. And in that moment, Standing over the butchered remains of my willows, I knew this wasn't over. They had made a colossal mistake, one they were going to regret. The view they so desperately coveted was about to change in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. The immediate aftermath of discovering my butchered willows was a blur of cold fury and a profound sense of violation. I spent a long time that first night simply staring at the devastation, the raw, pale stumps like open wounds in my beloved garden. The next morning, the full extent of their barbarity was even clearer in the harsh light of day. Tire tracks from heavy machinery crisscrossed my lawn, crushing flower beds and leaving deep indentations in the soil. Branches and debris were scattered, and the sheer emptiness where the trees had stood was a constant, painful reminder. My sanctuary had been invaded and despoiled. My first call was to the police to report the trespassing and destruction of property. An officer came, took my statement, photographed the scene, and looked suitably sympathetic, but ultimately admitted that HOA disputes were notoriously messy and often considered civil matters, unless clear criminal intent beyond the HOA's misguided belief in their own authority could be proven. He did, however, file a report, which I knew would be crucial. My next calls were to my insurance company and then, finally, to a lawyer specializing in property disputes and HOA conflicts. The initial consultation was grimly validating. The lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Albright, listened intently, reviewed my meticulously kept file of correspondence and photos, and confirmed my suspicions. The HOA had almost certainly overstepped massively. Their aesthetic harmony clause is not a blank check to destroy private property, she stated, especially mature, healthy trees that pose no demonstrable hazard. Their actions constitute trespass, destruction of property, and potentially conversion, as they've effectively taken the value of those trees from you. It was a small comfort, but the fight was just beginning. The true, unforeseen consequences of their actions, however, began to manifest subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. A few days after the trees were felled, following a moderate rain shower, I noticed the ground around the stumps seemed to stay damp longer than usual. I initially attributed it to the recent disturbance of the soil and the lack of canopy to intercept the rain. Willows are famously thirsty trees, their root systems extensive and highly efficient at drawing up groundwater. I knew this academically, but I hadn't fully appreciated the sheer volume of water those two titans must have been quietly managing day in, day out, for decades. The area where they stood had always been well drained, a testament to their silent work. Within a week, the persistently damp patches around the stumps began to expand. The soil took on a spongy quality. Puddles that would normally disappear in hours lingered for days. A faint, earthy, almost swampy smell started to permeate the air in that part of the garden, especially in the cool of the mornings and evenings. I started to research the history of my property, going through old survey maps and local geological records I could find online and at the county archives. My house was older than most in the development, built on land that had once been partially marshy before extensive agricultural draining in the early 20th century. I found an old anecdotal reference in a local history blog about Henderson's Bog being a landmark before my lot was developed, a notoriously wet piece of land. It seemed my willows hadn't just been beautiful, they had been vital, acting as natural, highly effective sump pumps for a latent underground spring or a very high water table that the original developers of my specific plot might have known about and planned around by allowing or even planting those water-loving trees. The HOA, in its infinite wisdom, had just unplugged nature's own drainage system. The change was most noticeable on my property first. but the land sloped gently downwards from my lot towards the newer houses in the development, particularly towards the pristine, meticulously manicured lawns of several HOA board members, including Brenda Milligan herself and her staunch ally, Gerald. I started to notice that their lawns, usually picture-perfect carpets of emerald green, were also beginning to show signs of unusual moisture. Small, dark patches appeared, areas where the grass seemed a little too lush, a little too green. Their automatic sprinkler systems, timed to perfection, continued to spray, oblivious to the increasing saturation from below. I saw Gerald one morning, poking uncertainly at a patch of his lawn with the toe of his shoe, a puzzled frown on his face. He looked up, saw me watching from my deck, and quickly straightened, offering a curt, uncomfortable nod before retreating indoors. Brenda's property, directly downhill from one of the former Willow sites, was next. Her prized rose bushes near her back fence started to look droopy, their roots likely waterlogged. A section of her immaculate lawn near the boundary line we shared began to look suspiciously like a patch of bright green algae was forming. I said nothing, did nothing. I just observed, a small, grim satisfaction beginning to bloom amidst my anger over the trees. They wanted a clear view, did they? Soon, the view might include their own backyards, slowly reverting to primordial swamp. The destruction of my willows was a grievous wound, but nature, it seemed, was about to serve up a unique form of poetic justice. The full impact was yet to come, but the early signs were undeniable. The earth was speaking, and it wasn't happy. The subtle dampness was just the overture to a much larger, much soggier opera. The persistent dampness on my property around the willow stumps soon graduated from an inconvenience to a genuine quagmire. The soil became so saturated that walking in that area meant sinking ankle-deep in mud. The earthy smell intensified, tinged with the distinct aroma of stagnant water. Small, iridescent flies began to hover, and at dusk, the mosquitoes were thicker than I'd ever known them. But the real drama, the part that brought a grim sort of satisfaction, was unfolding downhill, across the fence lines, in the once pristine backyards of Brenda Milligan, Gerald, and a few other key HOA figures who had vociferously supported the felling of my trees. Their perfectly manicured, chemically treated lawns, symbols of their suburban control and order, began a slow, inexorable transformation into marshland. At first, it was just squishy patches, the kind where your foot leaves a distinct, water-oozing imprint. Brenda's state-of-the-art robotic lawnmower, a source of immense pride for her, started getting bogged down. I witnessed it one afternoon, a scene of pure, unintentional comedy. The little machine whirring valiantly, its wheels spinning uselessly as it dug itself deeper into a newly formed mud pit in the middle of her formerly immaculate turf. Brenda herself came storming out, her face a mask of disbelief and then sputtering rage as she tried to wrestle the mud-caked robot free. She shot a venomous glare in my direction, as if I had somehow willed her lawn to liquefy. Gerald's entire backyard began to resemble a badly maintained rice paddy. His prized pudding green, which he meticulously tended, developed a series of unfortunate water hazards that were definitely not part of the original design. He hired a landscaping company, and I watched them install French drains, convinced that improved drainage was the answer. The drains, of course, were quickly overwhelmed. They were treating a symptom, not the cause. The problem wasn't surface water, it was groundwater, a relentless, steady upwelling now that my willows were no longer there to drink it up. The HOA, as an entity, started to scramble. Frantic emails circulated, not to me, of course, but I heard about them from my more sympathetic neighbor. There were emergency board meetings, hushed, anxious conferences on sidewalks. Initially, Their focus was on blaming external factors. Had there been a water main break? Was the county sewer system failing? They brought in plumbers, city engineers, all of whom found nothing wrong with the municipal infrastructure. The problem was localized, stubbornly persistent, and centered around their own properties. The irony was almost painful to watch, or perhaps deliciously so. They had destroyed my trees to improve their views and property values, and in doing so, had managed to significantly degrade both for themselves. Their backyards, once showpieces, were becoming unusable, unsightly bogs. The mosquitoes, drawn to the standing water, were becoming a neighborhood plague, rendering outdoor entertaining, a staple of Brenda's social calendar, almost impossible. One particularly amusing incident involved an outdoor barbecue Brenda attempted to host. Despite liberal applications of insect repellent and numerous citronella candles, the event was reportedly cut short as guests were relentlessly dive-bombed by swarms of mosquitoes that seemed to view the assembled humans as a particularly appealing buffet. The air of smug satisfaction that usually radiated from Brenda was replaced by a tight-lipped frustration. She stopped making eye contact with me altogether, which was a small blessing. I saw her pacing her backyard on multiple occasions, phone pressed to her ear, gesticulating wildly, presumably talking to yet another contractor or landscaper who was failing to solve her swamp problem. They tried sump pumps, but the water just seeped back in as fast as it was pumped out. They dug trenches, which quickly filled with stagnant, algae-slicked water, making their yards look like failed WWI battlefields. The cost of these futile efforts began to mount, and whispers of a special assessment to cover unexpected groundwater remediation started to circulate amongst the wider HOA membership, causing no small amount of grumbling from residents whose properties remained mercifully dry. The beauty of it was that the issue was primarily affecting the very people who had orchestrated the destruction of my trees. It was as if the earth itself was exacting a targeted revenge. My lawyer, Miss Albright, was kept appraised of these developments. "This is incredibly useful, Mr. Henderson," she'd said during one of our calls, a hint of amusement in her voice. "It substantiates our claim that the trees were performing a vital function. The HOA's actions have not only damaged your property, but have also demonstrably backfired on them, highlighting their negligence and lack of due diligence while they struggled with their self-inflicted wetlands. I was meticulously documenting everything on my side, too. I took daily photos of the spreading water on their properties, careful to do so from my own land. I noted the comings and goings of various work crews, the futile installation of drainage systems, the increasingly desperate looks on their faces. The common areas managed by the HOA, particularly a small parquet that bordered the affected properties, also began to show signs of waterlogging. The children's play structure stood forlornly in a muddy field, and the park benches offered a view of slowly encroaching marsh. Their quest for an unobstructed vista had yielded a vista of ecological imbalance and suburban decay. The satisfying part was watching their dawning realization that this wasn't a simple fix. This wasn't about a leaky sprinkler head or a blocked gutter. This was geological, elemental. They had disturbed a natural equilibrium, and the consequences were proving to be relentless and unforgiving. Brenda even had the audacity, through an intermediary, another board member as she still wasn't speaking to me, to suggest that perhaps something on my property was now causing the water issue. That theory died a quick death when their own hired experts, likely just confused landscapers, couldn't find any source originating from my land. The source was clearly under their land, a source that had been patiently, silently, waiting for the removal of its natural countermeasure. The once manicured, orderly suburban landscape was surrendering to a wilder, wetter reality, all thanks to their obsession with a slightly better view. The soggy saga was in full swing, and their desperation was becoming palpable. While the HOA leadership floundered in their self-created marshlands, I was methodically building my case. Ms. Albright advised me to get professional assessments to quantify both the loss of my willows and the likely cause of the sudden waterlogging. First, I hired a certified arborist, not just any tree trimmer, but a respected consultant with experience in legal valuations. He examined the stumps, the wood chips, my photographs of the living trees, and the HOA's correspondence. His report was damning. He valued the mature willows not just for their timber, which was minimal, but for their aesthetic contribution, their age, their ecological role, and the sheer cost of replacing them with trees of even a fraction of their stature, a sum that ran into tens of thousands of dollars. He also noted their excellent health prior to being felled, directly contradicting Brenda's fabricated claims of disease. Next, and crucially, I engaged a hydrogeologist. This was where things got really interesting. Dr. Evans, a woman with a calm demeanor and an impressive understanding of subterranean water flows, spent several days on my property and observing the surrounding areas, from public access points, of course. She took soil samples, analyzed historical geological maps I had already started to uncover, and studied topographical data. Her preliminary findings were almost immediate. "Mr. Henderson," she explained, pointing to a series of charts and maps laid out on my kitchen table. "Your property, and a significant portion of this development downhill, sits atop what appears to be a perched water table, likely fed by a shallow but consistent underground spring. The geological surveys from the 1950s, before widespread development here, hinted at this with notes on marshy conditions and high water table in this specific quadrant. She then pointed to diagrams illustrating the root systems of mature willow trees. "Willows are phreatophytes," she continued, "plants with deep root systems that draw a significant amount of water directly from the water table. Those two large willows were essentially acting as natural pumps, transpiring hundreds of gallons of water a day into the atmosphere during their growing season. Their removal has, quite simply, allowed the water table to rise to its natural, pre-willow level. The spring, which was always there, now has no significant uptake mechanism in its immediate vicinity." Her formal report was a masterpiece of scientific clarity. It detailed the probable flow of the spring, the soil saturation levels, and directly correlated the removal of my trees with the subsequent emergence of widespread waterlogging on my property, and, significantly, on the properties of Brenda, Gerald, and the affected HOA common areas. It wasn't malice on my part, or a broken pipe. It was cause and effect, pure and simple. The HOA had, through their ignorance and arrogance, unleashed the very conditions their predecessors, or nature itself, had mitigated with those magnificent trees. Armed with these expert reports, Ms. Albright drafted a formidable lawsuit. It detailed counts of trespass, destruction of private property, with the arborist's valuation, negligence for failing to perform due diligence before removing trees with a clear ecological function, and nuisance for the altered water conditions on my property due to their actions. We also sought injunctive relief to compel the HOA to remediate the water issue they had caused on my land, and, of course, punitive damages for their egregious behavior. The lawsuit was formally filed and served to each member of the HOA board, including a special hand-delivered copy to Brenda Milligan at her now rather swampy residence. I wish I could have seen her face. The HOA's reaction was predictable. Initial bluster, followed by a scramble to find a legal defense. They hired a law firm, undoubtedly at considerable expense to all HOA members, many of whom were probably unaware of the full extent of the board's culpability. Their lawyers first tried to argue that the HOA had acted within its rights based on the aesthetic harmony clause, and that the tree removal was a legitimate board decision. Ms. Albright was ready for this, citing case law that severely limited such vaguely defined powers, especially when it involved the destruction of valuable private property without proof of actual nuisance. Then they tried to insinuate that the water issue was an act of God, some unforeseen geological shift entirely unrelated to the tree removal. Dr. Evans's detailed report, however, systematically dismantled this argument, establishing a clear and scientifically sound causal link. The timing alone was damning. Pristine land before tree removal, boggy mess immediately after. Throughout this period, the affected HOA board members became increasingly agitated. Their expensive attempts at drainage continued to fail spectacularly. Their lawns were now beyond saving, resembling fetid ponds rather than turf. Mosquitoes bred in biblical numbers. Property values, the very thing Brenda claimed to be protecting, were undoubtedly plummeting for those specific houses. I heard stories of acrimonious HOA meetings where other, unaffected homeowners started asking pointed questions about the spiraling legal fees and the mysterious groundwater remediation fund that was draining their reserves. The board, particularly Brenda, became defensive and secretive, refusing to disclose the full details of the pending litigation to the wider membership, citing legal strategy. Ms. Albright, meanwhile, was relentless. She filed motions, requested discovery, which included all HOA internal communications regarding my trees. I could only imagine the delightful content within those emails, and scheduled depositions. The deposition of Brenda Milligan was apparently a sight to behold. According to Ms. Albright, Brenda was arrogant, evasive, and repeatedly contradicted herself, her composure fraying under polite but laser-focused questioning. She tried to portray me as the uncooperative, belligerent homeowner, and the trees as unsightly monsters, but her narrative crumbled against the weight of documented facts and expert testimony. Gerald, in his deposition, was reportedly a nervous wreck, essentially admitting they hadn't consulted any experts before ordering the trees cut and had relied solely on Brenda's fervent belief that the trees were bad and the views were good. The smoking gun moment during discovery came from the minutes of a closed-door board meeting where Brenda had reportedly said, "Henderson will make a fuss, but once the trees are gone, he'll get over it, and we'll all benefit from the improved sightlines. What's he going to do? Sue us?" That little gem, Miss Albright assured me, was going to be pure gold in court. Or, more likely, enforcing a very favorable settlement. The pressure was mounting on them, not just legally, but from the very earth they had sought to command. The discovery phase dragged on, as legal battles often do, but Ms. Albright was a tenacious bulldog. She meticulously gathered every piece of evidence. The HOA's increasingly desperate internal emails trying to find a solution to their self-made swamp, invoices for their failed drainage attempts, which ran into tens of thousands, a cost borne by all HOA members, and depositions from unhappy residents who were now questioning the board's competence and secrecy. Brenda Milligan's deposition was particularly enlightening for our side. Under oath, her composure cracked. She admitted that no hydrological or environmental studies were commissioned before the trees were cut. Her justification for the removal boiled down to her personal aesthetic preference and the vocal support of a few allies who stood to gain a slightly better view. She even tried to insinuate that I must have done something to my property after the tree removal to cause the water problem, a ludicrous accusation that Ms. Albright calmly and easily dismantled. The HOA's lawyers tried various tactics. They filed motions to dismiss, which were promptly denied. They attempted to countersue me for maintaining a nuisance, an argument so laughably weak, given the timeline and the expert reports, that the judge nearly chuckled when he read their filing. Their primary defense seemed to be that they were acting in good faith on behalf of the community, a claim that looked increasingly threadbare against the backdrop of their blatant disregard for my property rights and the ensuing environmental mess. As the court date approached, their lawyers started making noises about a settlement. Their initial offers were insulting, barely covering the cost of removing the stumps, let alone the value of the trees or the damage caused. Ms. Albright rejected them out of hand. "They're testing us, Mr. Henderson," she explained. "They still think they can bully their way out of this. We hold all the cards, especially Dr. Evans' report and their own internal communications. They don't want this going before a jury, especially a jury of local homeowners who might have their own HOA horror stories." The turning point came when we presented our expert witness list and summaries of their anticipated testimony. Dr. Evans's detailed analysis of the spring, the water table, and the direct causal link to the tree removal was irrefutable. The arborist's valuation of my lost willows was substantial. We also had a landscape architect ready to testify on the cost of restoring my property and installing a suitable water management system, far more complex and expensive than 2 willows, to deal with the now unleashed spring on my land. The HOA's own experts were local landscapers who were clearly out of their depth when it came to hydrogeology. Facing the prospect of a very public and very embarrassing trial, where Brenda's high-handedness and the board's incompetence would be laid bare, their resolve finally crumbled. Their lawyers requested a formal mediation session. We agreed. The mediation was a tense affair. Brenda, Gerald, and the HOA president, who had mostly been a figurehead, allowing Brenda to run rampant, sat on one side of a large conference table, their lawyers flanking them. They looked stressed and unhappy. Brenda, in particular, radiated pure, impotent fury, refusing to make eye contact with me. Ms. Albright laid out our case calmly and systematically, presenting the key evidence. When she played a short audio snippet from Brenda's deposition, where Brenda dismissively stated, "What's he going to do? Sue us?" Even the HOA's own lawyers winced. After hours of negotiation, offers and counteroffers passed back and forth by the mediator, we reached a settlement. It was a comprehensive victory. The HOA agreed to pay the full appraised value of my 2 mature willow trees, a figure that made Brenda visibly blanch. They agreed to pay for the complete regrading of the affected portion of my property and the installation of a sophisticated drainage system designed by Dr. Evans to manage the spring water now surfacing, a system that was far more expensive than simply leaving the trees alone. They also had to cover all my legal fees and the costs of my expert witnesses. Furthermore, the settlement included a formal, written apology from the HOA board for the unauthorized destruction of my trees and the distress caused, to be read into the official HOA minutes. Perhaps most satisfyingly, while not explicitly part of my settlement with them regarding my property, their own insurers were likely balking at covering the ongoing costs of remediating their self-inflicted swamp on HOA common land and the board members' properties, given the clear negligence involved. The financial implications for the HOA were significant, likely leading to hefty special assessments for all homeowners to cover their board's folly, a fact that I knew would not endear Brenda and her cronies to their neighbors. The court formally approved the settlement. The check, when it arrived, was substantial, but it was never just about the money. It was about the principle. It was about standing up to bullies who thought their petty desires and minor authority gave them the right to ride roughshod over others. My garden would never be quite the same without the ancient willows, but I plan to plant new trees, perhaps species also suited to managing damp ground. though none could replace the history and grandeur of the ones lost. The true, lasting irony was for Brenda and her allies. Their view was now permanently enhanced by a vista of their own deteriorating backyards. Their properties, once prized for their location, were now saddled with chronic water issues, endless mud, and a thriving mosquito population. The aesthetic harmony Brenda so desperately sought had curdled into a soggy, stagnant mess of her own making. They had cut down my trees, and in doing so, had effectively dug their own bog. I often walk by their properties now. The sounds of sump pumps are a constant drone. The smell of damp earth and algae hangs in the air. Their lawns are a patchwork of dead grass, muddy pools, and hastily laid, already sinking, paving stones. They got their view, all right. A clear, unobstructed view of the consequences of their arrogance. And I have my compensation, my apology, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, even in the face of HOA tyranny, justice, like water, will eventually find its own level. And sometimes it's wonderfully, satisfyingly muddy for those who deserve it. The final chapter of this saga played out not in a courtroom, but in the slow, inexorable decline of Brenda Milligan's reign and the physical transformation of the neighborhood she had tried to dominate. News of the settlement spread like wildfire through the HOA, despite the board's initial attempts to downplay its significance. When the special assessment notices went out to cover the legal fees, my compensation, the extensive remediation work on my property, and their own disastrously expensive and largely futile attempts to deswampify their land, the membership was incandescent with rage. There was an emergency HOA meeting, one that Brenda and her remaining board allies clearly dreaded. It was held in the same community hall as before, but this time, the atmosphere was not one of sycophantic agreement, but of open rebellion. Homeowners, armed with copies of the assessment and fueled by months of rumors and frustration, demanded answers. Ms. Albright had advised me to attend, not to speak, but simply to be a visible presence. My attendance alone seemed to unnerve Brenda, who studiously avoided my gaze, her face a pale, strained mask. One after another, residents stood up to denounce the board's recklessness, their secrecy, and the catastrophic financial and environmental mess they had created. Questions were fired about why no expert advice was sought before felling my trees, why my initial, reasonable offer of thinning was rejected, and why the board had pursued such an aggressive and ultimately costly legal battle they were clearly destined to lose. Gerald, ever the weaker link, stammered through a series of unconvincing excuses, mostly blaming unforeseen circumstances and differing legal interpretations. Brenda attempted to defend her actions, falling back on her tired rhetoric about community standards and protecting property values, but her words fell flat. Someone yelled out, "Whose property values, Brenda? Yours? Because mine just went down thanks to this special assessment, and my backyard doesn't even look like a Louisiana bayou." The meeting culminated in a vote of no confidence in the existing board. Brenda, Gerald, and their cohort were ignominiously swept from power, replaced by a new, interim board composed of more level-headed residents who promised transparency and a thorough review of the HOA's finances and bylaws. It was a stunning repudiation of Brenda's dictatorial style. The remediation work on my property began shortly thereafter, overseen by a team recommended by Dr. Evans. It involved installing a complex network of perforated pipes, gravel beds, and a discrete discharge system that channeled the excess spring water safely away to a nearby storm drain, effectively mimicking the drainage function of my old Willows, albeit in a far more engineered and expensive fashion. It was a significant undertaking, but the HOA, and by extension its members, footed the entire bill, as per our settlement. While my land was being restored, the affected areas downhill, particularly Brenda's and Gerald's properties, and the adjacent HOA common land, remained a testament to their folly. The HOA's attempts to drain these areas were proving to be a money pit. They'd brought in more landscapers, even an engineering firm, but the sheer volume of water from the unleashed spring, combined with the now compacted and ruined soil, made any quick fix impossible. Their once beautiful lawns were gone, replaced by expanses of mud, weeds, and reedy growth that thrived in the wet conditions. The mosquito population was legendary. Brenda's house, once a gleaming example of suburban perfection, began to look neglected. Her robotic lawnmower was permanently retired. Her prize roses had long since succumbed to root rot. She became a somewhat reclusive figure, rarely seen outdoors. The social gatherings she used to host were a distant memory. The irony was palpable. In her quest for a perfect, unobstructed view for herself and her friends, she had curated a perfect, unobstructed view of environmental degradation and her own spectacular failure. The long-term solution for their properties, as Dr. People Blank Evans had subtly hinted during one of our consultations, would likely involve embracing the water, perhaps creating designated wetland areas, rain gardens, or planting water-loving species like, well, willows. But the cost and complexity of such a radical redesign, especially on individual private lots within an HOA that prized uniformity, seemed prohibitive and unlikely. They were stuck with their swamp. I did eventually replant trees on my property, choosing species known for their beauty and their ability to thrive in moist conditions, though I situated them carefully with respect to the new drainage system. My garden began to recover, becoming a different kind of sanctuary, one that bore the subtle scars of the battle, but also the strength of resilience. I often wonder if Brenda ever reflected on the chain of events. If she ever considered that a little more humility, a little less arrogance, a willingness to listen, or even a cursory Google search on benefits of willow trees might have saved her, the HOA, and her neighbors a world of trouble and expense. Probably not. People like Brenda rarely engage in self-reflection. They simply move on to find new perceived infractions, new battles to wage, though her credibility in our neighborhood was irrevocably shattered. The HOA eventually stabilized under new leadership. They implemented stricter rules for board oversight and expenditure, and a renewed emphasis on respecting individual property rights. The aesthetic harmony clause was even reviewed, with added language to prevent such egregious overreach in the future. My story became something of a local legend, a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and the surprising power of nature. The phrase "pulling a Brenda" even entered the local vernacular for a time, meaning to stubbornly pursue a terrible idea with disastrous consequences. For me, the ultimate vindication wasn't just the financial settlement or the public apology. It was seeing the direct, unavoidable, and soggy consequences land squarely in the laps, or rather, the backyards, of those who had acted with such high-handed impunity. They wanted a better view, and they got one. A daily reminder of how their arrogance had transformed their manicured paradise into a mucky, mosquito-infested bog. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I can almost hear the ghosts of my old willows whispering their satisfaction over the gurgle of the pumps from Brenda's yard. The saga didn't just end with the financial settlement and Brenda's ousting. There were lingering effects, both for the community and for me. The new HOA board, chastened by their predecessor's debacle, adopted a far more cautious and consultative approach. They had the unenviable task of not only managing the ongoing financial fallout from the Great Willow War, as some wags began to call it, but also of rebuilding trust among residents. The special assessment needed to cover the costs was substantial, leading to a couple of lean years for other HOA projects and amenities. This, in itself, served as a constant reminder to all homeowners of the price of unchecked board power and ill-conceived crusades. The common areas near Brenda's and Gerald's former properties remained problematic. The HOA, after several more expensive and failed attempts at conventional drainage, eventually had to hire an environmental consultant, much like Dr. Evans, whom I had retained. The consultant's recommendations were, predictably, along the lines of embracing the wetlands. They proposed creating a series of interconnected rain gardens and bioswales, planting native marsh-friendly vegetation, and essentially turning the blighted common area into a sort of naturalized water retention zone. It was a sensible, ecologically sound plan, but also a visible symbol of the original mistake. The area would never be the pristine, manicured parquet it once was. Instead, it would be a managed wetland, a testament to the powerful spring my willows had once quietly tamed. For Brenda and Gerald, life in their swamp-adjacent homes became increasingly untenable. Their property values had undeniably taken a hit, not just from the water issues, but from the general notoriety of their involvement in the fiasco. Gerald, always the more timid of the two, sold his house at a significant loss within a year of the settlement. I heard he moved to a condo in a different town, likely seeking an environment where lawn care was someone else's problem entirely. Brenda, however, clung on for longer, her pride seemingly preventing an early retreat. Her once immaculate house began to show signs of neglect beyond the ruined yard. Paint peeled, and the once vibrant flower beds bordering her house were overgrown with weeds. She became a more isolated figure, the former queen bee of the neighborhood, now largely ignored. Eventually, nearly 2 years after the trees were cut, a "for sale" sign appeared in her soggy front yard. It stayed there for a very long time. Potential buyers were undoubtedly put off by the persistent dampness, the reputation of the property, and perhaps by whispered tales from neighbors about the curse of the Willows. When it finally did sell, it was for a price far below what it would have fetched before her crusade against my trees. The new owners, a young couple with a penchant for natural gardening, were apparently unfazed by the water. I even saw them consulting with a landscape designer who specialized in bog gardens. Perhaps Brenda's folly would eventually lead to an unintentional, albeit soggy, haven for someone else. As for me, my property was restored, but the experience left an indelible mark. I became much more involved in the HOA, not in a leadership capacity, but as an informed, vigilant member, determined to prevent any future abuses of power. I attended meetings regularly, read every document, and wasn't afraid to ask probing questions. Many other residents, similarly awakened by the Willow incident, did the same. The dynamic of the HOA changed for the better, becoming more democratic and less prone to the whims of a few individuals. The drainage system installed on my property worked efficiently, but it was a constant, mechanical reminder of what had been lost. No engineered solution could truly replicate the silent, organic grace of those ancient willows. I did, however, take great care in selecting new trees. I chose species that were not only aesthetically pleasing, but also known for their water-absorbing qualities, though on a smaller scale appropriate for the engineered drainage. My garden slowly healed and evolved. The quiet satisfaction of the victory remained. It wasn't just about winning a lawsuit. It was about reclaiming my peace, defending my rights, and seeing a measure of natural justice prevail. The entire episode served as a potent lesson for the whole community. Underestimating the wisdom of nature and the resolve of a wronged individual can have very messy, very expensive, and very damp consequences. Every time I looked out over my recovering garden, towards the now naturalized wetland area that was once HOA common ground, and caught a glimpse of Brenda's old, still soggy backyard, I was reminded that while they had tried to change my view, they had irrevocably changed their own, and not for the better. The rustle of my new trees in the breeze sometimes sounded like a quiet chuckle, a final, gentle mockery of their misguided campaign. And though the memory of the raw stumps still brought a pang of sadness, it was now overlaid with the enduring satisfaction of a battle hard fought and decisively won, a victory that had reshaped not just my property line, but the entire landscape of power in our little corner of the world.